Howdy, folks, and welcome to your storm chasing forecast show for Friday, July 24th. I am Gabriel Harbor, and we have a new sheriff in town for this show, coming to you all the way from North Dakota, I believe.
Yep.
We've got Mr. Kyle Gillett. How's it going, man?
It's going pretty good, Gabe. We got a severe weather risk up here in our neck of the woods, so might as well jump in here and ramble a little bit about what I think about this outlook.
We've been super excited to get you on one of these shows, but you have been crazy busy, absolutely tearing it up in the world of academia. I believe you just finished your graduate defense?
Yeah, that was just, was that last week? Yeah, that was just last week, and now moving on to graduation next week or the week after that. Gosh, my time is even all warped here. And then after that, it's right into the PhD.
Yeah, Dr. Cameron Nixon, soon to be Dr. Kyle Gillett. We are just absolutely blessed here at Storm Chaser Coaching with some of the brightest young minds in the field of meteorology.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Absolutely, and we are going to go into an overview for this setup in just a moment, but before we do, the awesome app that's on your screen right now, that is WeatherFront, folks, and if you would like to try it for yourself, there's a link in the description. If you buy it on mobile, you actually get access to the desktop app, the browser app. Nothing better in the industry. Kyle, I know you were waiting with bated breath for the Android version to finally come along.
Yeah, I like having everything in one kind of organized package, one-stop shop, and that is exactly what WeatherFront has been. Of course, and a lot of people are like, oh gosh, where's Android? They're two completely different languages that you have to write the apps in, two different processes, so just because you have one template doesn't necessarily mean you can just run right away with the other one. So had to wait. I was an impatient waiter for this, but we're getting the ball rolling there. It's great on desktop. It's pretty much everything you could want in one place, and they just keep adding to it, so it's great.
Absolutely. And let's go ahead here, Kyle, and dive into the high-level overview of the setup today. I see you've got the Outlook already pulled up, so what do you have for folks?
Yeah, this right here is the Storm Prediction Center Outlook for Friday. Now, this is a very classic summer sort of event, and if you've been looking at SPC Outlooks for a while, you might be able to figure out what's going on here already just by taking a look at this outlook here. So I'm actually going to use WeatherFront's handy little draw tool here and just show you something. If we have a severe weather threat that's maybe on the north here and then also further to the east, and then maybe some storms going up through maybe parts of the Great Basin here, you might be able to make out our flow pattern that looks something like this. And if you've heard any talk of the Death Ridge, that's exactly what we have right now. And we're going to be kind of tracking that as we go through this forecast here. So we have the slight risk that's over parts of the northern plains, into parts of the Northwoods here of Minnesota, and then also the small little marginal risk down in the Carolinas, parts of Georgia as well, pretty much right along the coast. And then just a chance for scattered storms, scattered convection throughout the rest of the CONUS, and lots of monsoon activity down here to the southwest. So it certainly is a busy time here as far as just general summer convection goes, but as everyone knows, 2026 has been an interesting year, and this is going to be another example of one of those kind of wonky setups where if you find yourself in the right place at the right time, things might work out for you, but there's a lot of kinks in this forecast. And the first one, that's going to be up north here in the northern plains. This is right at home here for me in eastern North Dakota, but this is a slight risk extending down from parts of the Canadian prairies where this severe weather risk extends further to the northeast. And then we're going to include pretty much all of eastern North Dakota down in the far northern South Dakota and pretty much all of northwestern Minnesota here, where we kind of have maybe two sort of modes in this severe weather threat. And then there's also a lot of time constraints to this as far as which areas are going to be favored and when. So we've got a lot to talk about here. Of course, we'll go into more details on that in a minute, but I can't let this second risk go. This isn't at least my cup of tea as far as chasing is concerned. This is very much going to be a sort of pop-up convection sort of event where you have tropical or marine influences here from the ocean and just enough of that instability and moisture, but then also just a little bit of lift to generate some more cellular convection that's going to show up here along the coast, and that might have some damaging winds associated with that. And just like we were saying before, we have this very clear sort of death ridge pattern, or this very large ridge that's centered over parts of maybe parts of the southern plains and also into the southwest and maybe even parts of the Great Basin at times here. Really, and this is going to be the case through the next couple of weeks here, but in this particular case, we've got a strong trough that's impacting parts of the northwest, and of course there's been some recent convection up in that area. But what we're seeing now is, especially as we go go into the forecast here, and I'll actually play this forward back and forth for you a little bit, you'll notice that there's just a tiny little bit, this very subtle troughing that's going to extend essentially from parts of Alberta here, and it's going to transition through parts of the Canadian prairies off to the kind of western part of Ontario as we go through this forecast period on Friday. The lift associated with that, and you can almost make out maybe this split flow pattern where we have part of the jet further to the north here, and then the jet that's swinging through on the top of the ridge. So this is going to combine here over parts of the northern plains and the Northwoods to give us that severe weather threat. But there's also a little bit of flow here over parts of the Carolinas and Georgia. And then, of course, you combine that, a little bit of flow, just a little bit of subtle flow, that's going to help promote some popcorn convection there. The other thing that you saw, though, is that we had this kind of widespread risk for severe weather, or rather thunderstorms, that extends across much of the plains and then into parts of the southwest. Why is that not necessarily a severe risk? It's in the middle of this ridge here, so this isn't the type of pattern that we're looking for strong synoptic lift to help support severe storms. Though, as we'll see later, there is a bit of instability down there. What we're lacking here is the lift and the shear associated, or the shear that we'd like to see associated with our severe weather risks. As far as temperature and dew point and those things are concerned, you've got this kind of expansive high pressure system off to the east. You have this kind of not terribly strong, but it's a decently strong surface low pressure by the Hudson Bay, and this kind of attendant cold front sweeping down through the northern plains here. You can see that with the wind shift here. The winds are pretty much from the southwest ahead of the front and from the northwest behind the front. You can also make out maybe a little bit of the kink in the isobars here as well, depicting that there's possibly a front there. If you go further to the southwest here, or further to the southeast rather, into the Carolinas and Georgia, there's not really a major signal here for anything crazy at the surface, as we'll find in a little bit. That's going to be more of a subtle pattern pretty much right along the coast, and some of that marine boundary influence there. A lot of heat, though, down in the southwest, and there's a lot of moisture in the southwest as well, and that's going to be a major player for the monsoon sort of situation here. So this kind of overall severe weather threat across the CONUS for Friday isn't terribly impressive, especially as we get into this late of the season. But the monsoon setup that we have here and have had over the last couple days is actually rather impressive because of this amount of moisture that we have that's kind of hanging around parts of the southwest. And so this is theta E here, and you can combine temperature and dew point essentially to create this sort of this theta E parameter, which is kind of showing us where the best moisture, the best instability, where's all that kind of aligning. And that's the idea that you can gain from this. There's a lot more uses for theta E, of course, but what this is telling us is that, okay, we've got a pretty good unstable atmosphere over parts of the southwest, the desert southwest, where the monsoon regime lives. We also have some decent instability because of the moisture plume that's extending up to the north here in parts of the northern plains into the Canadian prairies. Look at how much of this theta E is kind of built up over the southern plains. However, because the ridge is right on top of that, we're just not going to be looking at widespread severe weather there. And of course, we also have some of that extending up into the Carolinas as well. So that's pretty much the overview of this, Gabe. We've got this kind of localized area of severe weather across the north, maybe some stronger downburst related straight line winds in the Carolinas and the typical monsoon activity in the southwest. I think personally, all of this different parameters, as we'll talk about in a moment, combined, northern plains are probably looking like the most chaseable play.
Ladies and gentlemen, were you able to make out that he has some broadcast meteorology experience there?
It's been a few years, but I guess yeah.
I was definitely getting some vibes from that. And by the way, folks, if you want an Easter egg, go ahead and go to the Storm Chaser Coaching YouTube channel and look at the Storm Chasing Forecast playlist that this show actually lives in.
I just actually saw that for the first time in real life. I know you told me you were going to do that, but I just saw it today. I was scrolling through the channel, I was like, wait, what? So that's from the old days. Gosh, that picture is it's 2026. That's probably an 8-year-old photo there, I think. So
yeah, you are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in that picture, man. Let me tell you.
There was none of this there, that's for sure.
Nope, absolutely none of that.
No.
And Kyle, also, I have to call it out, right? I have to do WX Twitter, give it its due diligence. You called it a death ridge. Now, that's not technically a heat dome, but I'm wondering if that's close enough that we're kind of walking the line between what's acceptable to some people and what's not.
Yeah, I would say that the death ridge is more of a chaser slang, just because, as we just saw, all that instability over the southern plains, but that really does not mean much severe weather-wise, because that unfavorable synoptic lift, and that's why we call it death ridge. If you were to say that in broadcast TV, that probably wouldn't go over well.
Yeah.
That's why heat dome is a little bit of a nicer word. I know that we just had some interesting discussion over that in the last couple of weeks. Technically, it is a dome in the 3D sense. So yeah, that's an interesting one. This is technically a heat dome. It is hot. I wish the ridge would get out of here. It's for me being in the north. It's been too hot up here, so I would like that ridge to get out of here. But it doesn't look like it's going to leave anytime soon.
And if you guys are wondering what the hell Kyle and I are talking about, just type heat dome in on Twitter and look at what pops up. I guarantee you some of the top tweets over the past week or so will give you all the information that you need to know. It's patently absurd that these are the things we argue about in the year 2026, but whatever, man. Whatever floats people's boats.
Yeah, that's in a way the death ridge is directly responsible for our conversation on the heat dome because there was nothing else going on at that time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's when there's no storms, this is what people who are into storm chasing do. They start arguing about the most petty stuff imaginable. So Kyle, I'll go ahead and leave you to it. I know you said you wanted to dive down a little bit more granular into especially that northern target. So what do you have for us?
Yeah, I know we just talked about 500 millibars. I'm going to go back to that 500 millibar map for a minute here and just talk about this in a little bit more detail. And then we'll start zooming in on some things. Remember that SPC outlook? We essentially had that risk off to the north and then the risk down into parts of the Carolinas and far eastern Georgia. But again, it's the death ridge. That's this large ridge that's kind of set up across the southwest. And we call it the ridge because you can see the 500 millibar height lines do this kind of ridging pattern where they ride up to the north here. And when that happens, you can see the flow of air is coming from the southwest. So we're dragging all of that moisture and warmth from the desert southwest and dragging it out here onto the plains. And so in this particular case, in this setup here, what we're going to be tracking across the northern part of the United States for this northern risk is going to be pretty much the fact that we're going to be dragging some warm air that's associated with the high plains of the kind of northern parts of the U.S. and into pretty much southwestern Canada out onto the plains. One of the things in 2026 that we've been lacking, it seems like, is actually a decent CAP or EML or elevated mix layer. Remember, and we'll actually talk about this in a second, the CAP is essentially a region of warm air aloft, and that is going to be generated by the higher elevations off to the west. So just looking at this map here, we're kind of focusing on a risk that's over parts of eastern North Dakota. And what that means is we're at a lower elevation here in this particular area than we are out here, say, in central Montana. And this is where it's been pretty hot over the last few days. But if you look at this flow, we're essentially taking all of this air that's associated with that hot regime that's been pretty much in place over parts of the foothills of the Rockies, the high plains. It's going to be traveling towards the east into our risk area. And so what I'll show you here is essentially a 850 millibar. You could also imagine this being the same at 700 millibars, but this is pretty much a current map on where things are located as far as our temperatures. And what you'll notice right away is that we have this kind of warm air that's situated on the foothills of the Rockies. That's going to be dragged over to the east. And when that happens, you'll watch this kind of warm air extend from the west out to the east in time for our severe weather risk. So before we look at anything else, I want to show you what this is going to look like as far as soundings. And what you'll notice right away is that we have a cap that's in place. And some models show this a little bit worse than others, and you can see that here very clearly, essentially between 800 and 700 millibars. You have this large gap between the LCL and the LFC. And this is what we call an elevated mix layer or a cap. And you can tell that it's an elevated mix layer because the temperature is warming or not cooling, and the dew point is also drying in the same layer. And that's the condition that has to be met to be an EML. Just because the sounding is dry does not mean there's a cap or an elevated mix layer. The elevated mix layer is essentially this layer where we are simultaneously warming and drying. And so we can see that elevated mix layer extending in this kind of the warmer air here from the west in the foothills of the Rockies out to the east. Remember, we have lower elevation in North Dakota than we do out in Montana. So at 850 millibars in North Dakota, that's above the ground. But as you get into Montana, 850 millibars is essentially at the ground. So that means that air is just sliding right over North Dakota. So that's where our cap is going to be coming from. And that's going to be a major player here as we go forward. Before we go in any further, I actually like to start with simulated reflectivity. I know a lot of people might argue with that, but I think it's important to kind of draw context as to how the model world is thinking that the event is going to evolve. And then you start looking at things and analyzing, okay, this is what I know from the observations. This is how I think it might play out in my head versus what the models and the cams are actually showing me. We're going to go forward here. This is just her simulated reflectivity. I do not have the updraft helicity tracks on here. So this is just straight up updraft helicity or straight up simulated reflectivity. So this right here is the HRRR simulated reflectivity. There's no updraft helicity on here. And what we're going to find is as we get into Friday morning, we have this area of convection and precip that's moving through pretty much the northern risk area, the southern part of the Manitoba risk area, and the northern part of North Dakota and Minnesota here. And you might say that there's some thunder associated with this, and it's essentially going to be staying north of Highway 2, which runs from Minot here down to Devil's Lake and into Grand Forks and then over to Bemidji. And this convection is likely elevated. If we were to take a sounding here just outside of Grand Forks at the time that this is rolling through, this is 17Z going into kind of the later part of the morning into the afternoon. You have that stout elevated mixed layer here still, and you have this elevated moisture. And I know Cameron has explained this a couple of times, but when you have this area of elevated moisture, that's hinting that the fact that there's probably going to be some form of cloud cover there, and that might be the layer from which we're sourcing our instability. And so that might be where these storms are rooted at. And if that's the case, that means our environment is going to become contaminated by this elevated convection rolling through. And I want you to notice the time here. If this is happening as we start getting into the early afternoon hours, we're really pushing the clock here as to whether or not the atmosphere can recover. It's the end of July, which will help, and the death ridge is also, there's a lot of heat there, so there could be something that helps us out. But I want you to note that we have this early convection rolling through, and then the HRRR says, okay, maybe we'll refire. Of course, this looks pretty messy at this point. This is getting into the kind of middle part of the evening, and then off towards sunset here, we end up in parts of pretty much north central Minnesota. At any rate, we probably will see at least some form of convective initiation, but the convective mode, that's up in the air, and we'll talk about that in more detail as we roll forward. So I'm going to go back into some of the environmental things now. So this is going to walk through some environmental parameters that I think are going to be important. And of course, I think it's always important to start out with the basics. Let's just look at temperature, dew point, those sorts of things. So this is temperature as we roll through parts of late Friday morning into the afternoon. And remember, we were talking before about this low, and you can't see it on the HRRR, but it's up here in parts of kind of central Manitoba, extending off into western Ontario, up towards Hudson Bay. And what's going to happen here is we kind of have this trailing cold frontal feature that's going to extend down into parts of the northern plains. And maybe there's some baroclinicity along this, which essentially is the fact that we have this warmer air on one side, maybe cooler air on the other side, and maybe that we have this wind shift along the front. And so maybe we might get this little area of low pressure to spin up here in along this front. And when that happens, maybe we might back the winds a little bit more, sort of thing. But in any case, what we see here is we see this kind of frontal boundary that's moving off to the south and east here. And you'll notice in the temperature field, okay, maybe the HRRR is cooling off here because there's actually some convection developing pretty much right along the kink of that front. Pretty much straightforward. We have a cold frontal-esque boundary that's going to be responsible for driving convective initiation as we go into the afternoon and evening hours here on the northern plains. However, there is still this risk for early convection. And as you can see here, the frontal boundary appears to be back over western parts of North Dakota, and it might be difficult to see here in the temperature field. I'll throw our precip back up here for you. You can see that's well out in front of that frontal boundary, which is further to the west. And as we'll see here in a minute, there's still some upper level waves that are moving through here. Perhaps there's some other surface boundary that also seems to be moving through at this time. And so that's going to complicate. It's going to be a fly in the ointment here for us as we go through this forecast. So that's our temperature. Another thing we can look at here is that theta E again. And actually, before we do that, we'll just look at dew point. This will kind of give us some solid ground to stand on. And this is kind of going through the morning. So obviously we see this nice pool of moisture up from the south as that low starts to deepen up by Hudson's Bay. So we've got this nice southerly flow here, and you'll watch the cold front boundary kind of squeeze through right through here. There's not a major change in the dew point. A lot of times when we have this sort of death ridge situation or this death ridge configuration to the environment, we don't see really strong frontal boundaries. So even though there is a frontal boundary that rolls through here, you can see it's actually pretty difficult to see it in the dew point field. You can see it best in the wind field where you have have more of these southerly or southwesterly flow here to more of a westerly or northwesterly flow behind it. And you'll notice that we have this nice southerly flow that's bringing up that moisture. If you watch closely, you'll actually be able to see the convection rolling through northern North Dakota here and parts of northwest Minnesota earlier on. That's going to change our dew point. You'll notice it actually increases the dew point in this particular case because we're adding moisture to the atmosphere as that rain is falling. And so maybe we modulate the dew point in a positive way here, but we still have that cap. So we've got to be able to break that cap, and if we have the clouds and the convection that's rolling through early in the morning, that might prevent us from warming up enough to break that cap, as we'll talk about here in just a second. So there's our dew point field, and by the way, these dew points aren't too bad. Most of this is going to be purely from advection. We don't have a lot of corn up here in the Red River Valley. The border between North Dakota and Minnesota is the Red River Valley, the Red River, which extends down through here. So this is the Red River Valley. We don't have a lot of corn here, more so to the south, but this isn't necessarily corn sweat. This is just good old-fashioned advection rolling up through parts of the northern plains here. And we'll go back to theta E. We have high theta E here. One thing I want you to notice is that as this front moves through, essentially right here, you can see we have this kind of southerly, maybe even southeasterly at times flow to the east, and this kind of northwest flow back to the west of this front. The higher theta E is actually maybe back behind this front, not in front of it, and that is because we have more heat. And so theta E is a combination of dew point and temperature, right? So both of these things are going to weight the theta E. This is a good way to analyze what our instability might be in a different way than CAPE or any of the other parameters you might look at for instability. And this is telling us that at the surface, maybe the best instability is actually located behind the front in this case. And part of that is due to the fact that the dew points back here are higher because of that morning convection that's going to be rolling through. So we'll keep that in mind. We can look at actual CAPE though. And so this is going to be going through parts of the morning. You can see we clearly have some instability that's going to be building in here, and it's pretty stout instability. This isn't too bad for this area here this time of year. This is pretty normal, getting up to 2,500 joules. And this is mixed layer CAPE, by the way. So this is taking into account maybe some drier air that we might have, possibly also associated with that elevated mixed layer. But we're building in some good instability here, but again, you'll notice that the better instability is actually behind that front. And I'll draw the front here for you. Again, I know you don't have winds, but it's going to be something like this, more or less. And so the higher instability is actually behind the front in this case. So if a storm develops on the front, and it essentially is moving down to the southeast like we saw in the HRRR reflectivity, it's actually going to be moving into potentially a less CAPE environment. Now that's going to be slowly drifting to the southeast as the evening wears on here. We're now pretty much at dark at this point, but these storms might outrun their instability as they move to the south and east. And so that's of course something to pay attention to. But when you have this kind of broad pool of instability, if something's able to go up on the front with all else held equal, we should be able to get a storm in this particular environment. Now, whether that storm is something we want to really chase is going to be another question. We're talking about instability. Let's look at the SIN, right? So SIN is the convective inhibition. So it's essentially the negative of CAPE. So if you have, or the opposite of CAPE, if CAPE is positive buoyancy that's helping air parcels to rise, SIN is essentially the opposite of that, which is preventing air parcels from rising. And so as we go through the morning hours and into the early afternoon, remember that I had discussed before that we're going to watch this warm air from the west, from Montana and parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan. That is going to drift east into the northern plains in eastern North Dakota, and the EML, because it is warm, it is actually a source of SIN. So we can actually watch the EML drift to the east here in the SIN field as we go into parts of the later morning hours into the afternoon. So we actually have quite a bit of convective inhibition here. This is quite a bit here. Now it's still early on in the day, but this right here, and I'll actually pull a sounding right in the middle of this kind of SIN bullseye here. That's a lot. That's a pretty stout cap. We've got really intense warming there in those lower levels. The distance between the LCL, the lifted condensation level, that's our cloud base height. That's when a parcel becomes saturated. And our level of free convection, once you get to that point, you don't need to be forced anymore. That air parcel is just going to rise. So you want those to be right next to each other. You want the cloud, this rising parcel, to essentially saturate and become a cloud and then just go on its merry way up. But if there's a large gap here, that means you have to have something to force it upwards to make it through that SIN. This is where that SIN is coming from, that EML layer right here. And so as we go through the later parts of the afternoon, that tries to wear off a little bit, but you never see it eroded. You never see that sin actually go away. So we're still dealing with some of that sin as storms develop. So this is right before storms develop here, and I'll kind of take a couple soundings here to visualize what this looks like. And so this is a little further north. You can see we've got decent dew points here. We've got into the 60s. Ignore that photograph for now, because that's a nice looking photograph. We're gonna ignore that for a minute. And you can see, okay, maybe we have actually eroded some of that convective inhibition that was evident here at the time, but we still have this very large inverted V sounding. If you look at the LCLs, they're pretty high. This is the actual height of the LCL. We're at about 1,600 meters. So really when we're getting above 1,000 meters, we're starting to get really high up there. I do think we have convective inhibition, but I think that some of the factors in this particular environment are going to lead to upscale growth. And so that's the whole question of chaseability, right? And the thing about the SPC outlook is, are we going to see hazards? Not are the storms going to be good to chase? In this case, we're probably going to see convective initiation. We're probably going to see some hazards out of it, but is it going to be a good chase? Of course, that depends on your standards, but we'll talk about that more here in just a few minutes. So we have this convective inhibition that really doesn't erode away. And part of that is due to the fact that we have this EML that's going to be lingering. Part of that's going to be because of the convection that's rolling through the northern part of the risk area as we go through the morning. That's going to cause some issues. The other interesting component to this, and this is a very Death Ridge related component to this forecast, is actually smoke. So we've got a little bit of wildfire smoke outside right now. It's been mostly high in the atmosphere, but you'll watch, because we have that Death Ridge that's dragging all that air from the west out into the east. With that and all the active wildfires going on in parts of the United States and Canada, that is going to be dragging some wildfire smoke directly over the risk area as we get into parts of the later morning and into the afternoon. What that's going to do is potentially limit the amount of destabilization that we can do by way of limiting the effect of the sun on increasing our temperatures throughout the day. So if you have, and I'll actually pull this up here, we're going to go out into the ocean. This is one of my favorite things about WeatherFront here. We're going to do a little drawing. I want to show you, like, if we have a sounding that might look something like this, where we have that big EML that we were talking about earlier, and I'll draw the dew point here in blue, and maybe it looks something like this, right? If we aren't warming up enough, what we want to see, I'll draw it in gray here, what we want to see is, with the day going on, we want to see our temperature start to warm up to look something like this, which means that we don't have a layer of warming at all anymore. It's essentially now where our temperature would start to look something like this. However, if we aren't able to warm up enough because the sun is being blocked by smoke, we could potentially be limiting the amount of warming that we're going to do down here in this layer, and that could hurt our chances of destabilization. The other thing that I want to talk about here is, as we go into the afternoon, and we saw this back when we were looking at some of the sin, right? And I'll pull another sounding here to show you that. And I'll probably have to go back to the sin to actually do that. But if we pull another sounding into the evening, and so perhaps we are actually, I think my thing is still on here. There we go. So if we pull a sounding, and we're actually able to get rid of some of that elevated mix layer, in this particular case, it's not that. Let's go a little further. Right before we see storms start to fire up, we've got two problems here that could be helping our storms become a little bit of a HP mess. And typically what that means is we have more rain coming down than we're able to pull in inflow. And in some cases that makes storms difficult to chase. It might make storms difficult to retain enough inflow to become tornadic. What I want to point you to in this case, let's say we do warm up enough, and you can see that maybe we've eroded almost all of that sin. We now have what's called an inverted V profile at the surface and those tall LCLs. We're still at about 1,400 meters here in this particular LCL. What that means is there's a lot of distance between the cloud base and the ground, and it's also dry between the cloud base and the ground. So as rain falls through there, it's going to evaporate on its way to the ground. When that happens, it's going to cool. The more evaporation that we have, the more cooling that we have, the stronger those downdrafts are going to be, and the higher likelihood that they will be potentially destructive to a storm being able to pull in inflow and maybe produce tornadoes. Some research has also shown that smoke can also add to this effect, where we are creating more precip than the storm is able to handle because of all the smoke particles up there. So that's maybe a little bit more of a experimental component to this forecast, if you will, Gabe, but that's something that we're looking at here where the smoke might be harmful in more ways than one. So that's the dynamic side of this. We can talk about the wind shear here. Of course, we're on this kind of periphery of the death ridge with that jet aloft. So we have a little bit of shear to speak of. This is going into the evening, though. This is 21Z, and we have not a lot of shear in the main risk area until we get up north where that leftover convection is. And that this is a convective feedback, if you will. But you will see that as we pull up some of that better or more low-level jet activity as we get into the evening, this low-level shear, this is 0 to 1 kilometer shear, by the way, that will see an increase. However, there's a bit of a problem there. If we are seeing our low-level wind not increase until we get later into the evening hours, and I'll go back to our simulated reflectivity here, remember what time we're actually seeing initiation happen. If we have initiation pretty much around maybe 21 to 23Z, but our low-level wind is not getting better until after 0Z, that means that the storms that are initiating aren't actually feeling that good low-level wind until later. Now, if you want low-level wind to organize your convective mode into something that's supercellular and easy to chase, you want that wind shear to be there when it initiates, because once the storms go up, if there's nothing good to organize them, they're going to grow upscale, and then we have the additive effect of maybe the stronger downdrafts, the reasons we just talked about. We're more than likely going to see probably an upscale growth mode before we actually see that low-level shear increase as we get later into the evening and get closer to sunset. Now, deep layer shear is not too bad. We see, of course, it's going to decrease a little bit as we get into parts of the day and then increase as we get later into the afternoon and evening, as you'd expect, and as some of that better flow arrives. So deep layer shear isn't all too bad here across the risk area, but that low level shear will definitely increase as the low level jet increases as we go into the evening, and you can see that again right here. Now, I'm going to pull up my favorite here, Gabe. This is the STP. This is a significant tornado parameter.
I think you're lying about that, by the way.
Maybe. It's possible. But this is something I want to share here. We've got to be careful with the STP, and obviously this is an extreme example, but I want you to notice this bullseye here. And I'll throw up the reflectivity on top of this so we can kind of get an idea. Do you notice that area of STP is located right underneath this area of convection that's moving through western Minnesota here? This is not ambient environment STP. This does not mean that the environment has this amount of significant tornado parameter. Clearly, there are significant problems with this sounding, right? That's because this sounding was taken in the middle of a thunderstorm. And so I think there's probably a few errors in there, right? If you look at that.
Where did it go? It just went for a journey off the side of the graph.
Yeah, I think it's a nuclear weapon here. But so the point here is that we have a bullseye of STP because it's being influenced by the fact that the storm is there. The storm is going to create this local environment that might have better shear and better instability and different things. As you can see, the instability is not too different, but the photograph is very different. And so that's why we see that. So when you're looking at things like STP, the more accurate STP is probably going to be some of this lighter color out here in the ambient environment away from the convection. And so if you look at this looks a little bit better. Obviously the thermos way out to the east there aren't too bad, but this is a nice photograph. And I will say that if you were to take this photograph and turn it a little bit so it's the wind field is a little bit more west to east, this looks a lot like the Mound City photograph. In fact, this is a photograph that would have me very excited, especially as a Grand Forks resident, had our initiation mechanism and instability been a little bit better. So I don't think we're going to get quite that good of a setup here, but just because of the instability in the initiation situation. But yeah, in general, I would say that the wind shear environment is pretty nice, but I think there's a few complicating factors, especially early on, that are going to limit our potential. However, if for some reason that cap does hold, if the cap holds long enough to when the shear is increasing at the same time that those storms are initiating, we might have a totally different story where we're actually looking at discrete convection that might be supercellular for a time, because that profile is not too bad. The last thing I'll really go into here for the northern mode is I want to look at the HREF, and so this is essentially going to be the cam ensemble, if you will, and we're going to be looking at mean parameters here. So this is dew point. Obviously, you have a nice warm sector that's got a lot of moisture associated with it. This is really going to help us out and look pretty good here. No real issues with dew point on this particular event. Now, as we look at something like the HRF, this is essentially all of the cams, all of their updraft helicity greater than 75 meters square per second squared. And so we're going to essentially bullseye these areas where all the cams are agreeing and where we might have an increased probability of seeing updraft helicity tracks. As we go into the evening, you can see it lights up a little bit, but we just don't have a consistent signal. The one thing I like to see with HRF updraft helicity tracks is that we're seeing this kind of consistent area that grows and kind of maintains itself with time. When you see this more flashy appearance, that means we're seeing convection that's trying to become supercellular, at least in the model, of course, but the model's unable to maintain a supercell mode. And that's essentially what we're seeing here, where you can see this kind of poppy off and on area. Now, if you look further up in Ontario, pretty much no man's land up here, north of Lake of the Woods down to Lake Superior, you see that signal, right? You can see that area kind of develop high probabilities and it maintains itself. That's what we want to see for a better chance of long-lived supercells, but we just don't see that here in our risk area. And that's going to be because cams are not showing discrete tornado-producing supercell structures in the forecast field. So another thing we can look at here is also a 4-hour probability of tornado, and this comes from SPC guidance within the HRF. And so if we look at this, of course, we see the risk up here in Ontario. Again, no man's land, this kind of consistent risk that we can follow with time. However, if we're looking back here in the States, in parts of North Dakota and Minnesota, you will notice, okay, maybe we have this little consistent area in northwest Minnesota, parts of northern North Dakota, where we actually might have a tornado risk. But if you remember, that is the area where this environment has been contaminated by the previous convection. So the actual tornado risk that you might be looking at here for something that's worthwhile chasing is probably going to be more like down in here, right? That's where you'd want to see it. This is going to be stuff that's overrun by that previous convection. And so that's not really what we're going to be looking for as far as a positive signal for our chaseability for this event. We can also look at hail here. Hail might be one of our slightly better options if we're able to kind of maintain a good storm mode that's favorable for hail. Too much upscale growth can be bad, but you can see we still have that heightened signal for maybe some hail, especially up in Ontario and some of that leftover convection that moves through early in the morning. Gabe, what I would say here for this kind of overarching view is the fact that, yeah, we're probably going to have storms up here in this northern risk, but overall, we're probably going to have more of this messy mode, maybe some discrete storms that last kind of for an hour or so before we see some upscale growth. Unless that cap holds for long enough, then maybe this is one of those, not necessarily a big risk, but could be a high reward if we're able to get something to fire and stay in that good environment.
See, I was actually tracking along with you on Polymarket as I was watching the odds of Kyle Gillett becoming a professor someday go up from, yes, around maybe 30, 35 cents. And I managed to grab it at 42 cents before it shot over 50. Well, so I'm feeling pretty good about my shares at this point.
Yeah, we'll see.
I love it, man. It's great stuff.
Yeah. I think as a Grand Forks resident, it will be on my radar, no pun intended, but I think that several aspects of this could be better.
Now, did you want to still go into the southern mode real quick?
Yeah.
Southeastern mode?
Yeah, this is going to be pretty quick. In the southeast mode, this is a weak upper level flow event. We don't have a main kind of frontal boundary moving through. So if we just look at simulated reflectivity here, what you'll notice is we kind of have this area of just kind of popcorning convection. And this right here along the coast of pretty much all of South Carolina, maybe down into Georgia, parts of North Carolina here. This is what that main risk area is going to be for. We're going to be seeing essentially a boundary that's going to be set up along this here, caused by the marine influence. You can see we maybe have some northerly winds here on land. We have the northerly winds from the ocean. Pretty much during the day, the land heats up so much and the air is becoming cooler that you see a pseudo cold front effect where you have the sea breeze coming on shore. And so we're going to create this little boundary here where we're seeing the winds essentially meet each other. That convergence is going to help foster the development of convection right along the shore. And so what is potentially going to happen with this particular environment is, okay, maybe we actually get some stronger winds here and we can actually pull a sounding in here. You'll notice that there's nothing too crazy special about this. As storms develop, there's not a lot of shear, right? This is essentially zero shear environment. The hodograph is all contained within the 20 knot radial here. So there's really no wind faster than 15 knots on this entire.
Yeah, that hodograph could win you an Olympic event for shooting.
Exactly. Yeah. You launch a balloon in this and it's pretty much going to come right back down probably. But what you'll notice is we have this pretty much super weak shear environment, but we have decent amount of instability. And we still have a little bit of that inverted V profile here maybe. So what that's suggesting here is, okay, maybe if we get some storms that develop, especially in a boundary, they might be pretty strong, but then they'll collapse and we might have some stronger downdrafts associated with them. And so this isn't terribly chaseable here. You can see that as we get into the afternoon, here goes that area of development, and then it just kind of sits there for a little while, dies out. There's no main supercell structures in this or anything like that. We just have a nice thermodynamic environment, and we're seeing this boundary kind of impinge along that, and that's going to help us. If this helps, I'll throw the updraft helicity tracks on here. Oh, there you go. So we need to go, was it just north of Charleston? Pretty much, what time would you have to be there? You'd have to be there pretty much right at 20Z, and that's going to be your only shot. That's going to be where Tornado of the Year is going to happen, just north of Charleston.
Lock it down, folks. Get those coordinates locked in.
There you go. Yeah. Let's see here. So this is pretty much going to be happening probably right as that boundary initiates. And so there's going to be so much instability, associated with this, that we have this nice kind of lift here on that boundary. So that's probably what's going to be promoting at least the model to think that there's going to be something there. But pretty much up and down convection along that boundary. I think, honestly, the real play here is going to be the monsoon stuff. If you want nice storm structure, lightning over all our crazy southwest monuments and stuff like that, monsoon, that's going to be the real play.
I think Trey is still out there, actually, so he's probably going to be basking in the glory of some awesome downdrafts.
Yep. If I'm not mistaken, I think Hunter's going to be headed out there. Jim Tang is out there. Everybody's out there right now. Monsoon season's here, and it's been pretty good. There's a ridiculous amount of moisture out here.
Some super exciting news as well, folks. We actually have lowered the price of our channel membership. It is only $2.99 right now. And if you're on an iPhone, I believe that actually bumps up to $3.99, but same difference. It's under $5. You get lots of awesome perks like participating in our live streams, asking questions, weekly bonus videos, a coach Q&A chat on our Discord server where you can ask people like Kyle questions about anything that tickles your fancy. And really, it's the best way that you can let us know you appreciate the content that we're making, and it helps me to make sure all of our coaches and our staff who work behind the scenes can get paid and taken care of. So if you really enjoy this, please consider clicking that button to join our channel membership. We would greatly appreciate it. Okay, Kyle, I've got a couple of questions for you. Mainly it has to do with the actual terrain and chaseability of the North Dakota area, because I know that's a place that a lot of chasers don't get out to very often just because it's so geographically distant from a lot of other places where chasers normally are. Yeah. What are the road networks like? What's the cell service like? I've heard a lot of stuff about Native American reservations, and sometimes you'll run into issues there. Could you maybe just give us a quick breakdown of what it's like chasing in that eastern North Dakota, western Minnesota area?
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up here. This is essentially the satellite map of eastern North Dakota, western Minnesota here. Very obviously, right away, you can tell that there are some areas that look good, other areas that don't look good. And so you can pretty much draw the line from pretty much just east of Winnipeg down through parts of northwest Minnesota, up here by Roseau. This isn't too bad. But once you start getting further to the east, you can see that the trees and the lakes start to pick up. So down in this is essentially a good chase map. To the east, we like this. We do not like this over here to the east. There's so many trees and lakes over here. The roads become very difficult to navigate. Some of the smaller roads, the state roads, also become less frequent. The further east you go, I know some people have been able to chase further to the east here, like towards Big Fork and stuff like that, but you start to getting into like the Boundary Waters canoe area, all that sort of stuff, so it gets a lot more difficult to chase the further east you go. However, I might be a little biased, but I do think that the Red River Valley of eastern North Dakota and western Minnesota is one of the best chase plate terrains on the planet. I think that the road grid is really good in most areas. It does get a little hairy kind of northwest of Grand Forks at times, but it's pretty much all decent gravel roads. There's a lot of agriculture here, and we can zoom in and just look at some of this. But This is a pretty good chase area. It's all fields here in western Minnesota and eastern North Dakota. Again, like I said, good road grids. You can see there's a lot of state roads. There's also I-29 here. It's got really good north-south road. This is all pretty good. The Native American reservations are all pretty much off here in parts of western Minnesota, pretty much around the lakes here. I've never had an issue with them, of course, but for the most part, this is excellent chase terrain. I love chasing up here northwest of Grand Forks and northeast of Grand Forks. Between Grand Forks and Fargo, it is excellent. There's so many good roads through here. Visibility is unbelievable. I've never had an issue. But once you start getting too far into Minnesota, that's where I start drawing the line. Pretty much, if you're to go down US 2 here, pretty much between Fosston and Badgley, especially to Bemidji, it just starts to become unbearable because of the trees. And from a photographer's perspective, I have no desire to shoot grainy tornadoes to the trees. Great question. I think it's an excellent place to chase.
Awesome. Kyle, let's go ahead and move over to, I'm not sure what we'll name it now that we have you here. We have been calling it Cam versus Cams. I'm not really sure what kind of alliteration I'll come up with for you, but give it time. I promise I'll come up with something. So if you want to load up some convection allowing models and maybe take us through and let us see what the event is doing from cam to cam.
Because Cam is not here, against his better wishes, I'm going to start with the RRFSA. Let's look at the worst possible.
You dirty dog. Scenario. I can't believe you did it to him, man.
Yes, I'm sorry, Cameron. But this is a good little thing to look at here. Like, what is the worst case scenario? I do think that the RFS, and I don't like saying RRFs. I can't say it fast, so I just say RFS. I hope nobody has a problem with that. But the RFS actually doesn't seem to do too bad with location, but its intensity obviously is absolutely terrible. But what you'll notice here is we're still seeing some of that early convection that's riding through in the morning, and that's going to be a bit of a problem as we've discussed at length before. And so as we get into the evening, we have this area of intense convection that's kind of going over Grand Forks. Of course, maybe the timing, maybe the location is right. Do we actually have storms this strong at this point? I doubt it. Now, the version 2, I think the version 2, though, is still a little aggressive. It's similar to the NAM nest, not necessarily in the intensity of convection, but the coverage of convection. So I think we just have too much convection here. And so it's a little bit messier than what I actually think we will see. You can see it's kind of just developing things all over the place. The primary signal that you'll notice here is, though, that we still have that kind of morning stuff moving through the northern part of the risk area in southern Canada. And then also we have convection initiation happening as we get into the later afternoon and evening in parts of eastern North Dakota and northwestern Minnesota. That is a consistent signal. Some of these NSSL cams are very different. So this is all 21Z here. You know, this is just totally bonkers here. Some of these are going to be way out of left field, and so they're all just designed a little bit differently to show us different things. But the main signal here is, okay, maybe we have this corridor from eastern North Dakota into northwestern Minnesota. That, of course, that's in line with the SPC outlook. The FP3 here, again, totally bonkers, way too intense. But the fact is that we do have convective initiation showing up in the cams. Now, I have a love-hate relationship with the NAM nest. There's been times where, like in 2025, I actually didn't mind the NAM nest. It actually did pretty good for me a few times. It's been a little wishy-washy in 2026, as I'm sure everybody knows. But again, we're still seeing, okay, maybe we have this convection initiation happening 20 to 22Z-ish west-northwest of Grand Forks, and then moving off to the south and east. I think that the convective evolution here is kind of funky, but in general, based on what I've seen, it would appear, I think that the HRRR is probably going to be the best option here for us as far as just simulated reflectivity, how the HRRR thinks the event is going to evolve. If we do see the morning convective contamination as intense as the HRRR suggests, with these kind of elevated storms moving through. If we don't see that, it's going to be a totally different ballgame. But I definitely think that if the HRRR is right about this, then the way it evolves the convection later on is definitely in the ballpark. And if you look at some of these other cams, we still have this messy signal across the board. And if we go to maybe the NamNest, what our other quality cam, if you could say that, we look at a sounding here, you'll notice some of the same things. We have some small low-level shear at this time because we haven't seen the low-level jet pickup yet. Still have decent mid-level shear. We still have maybe that inverted V profile, really high LCL. So no matter what cam you look at with other biases and things, they're still showing the same signal where, yeah, shear doesn't look too bad. Maybe we have the nice Mountain City profile or something. But the fact is that on the thermodynamic side of the equation, we're seeing things that might be tending to lead us to more of a upscale growth sort of thing. And that's what all the cams seem to say. So we have this kind of consistent signal here. Like I said before, I think the way that the 0Z HRRR handles this is probably what we're going to see. I guess the one caveat I would say is I do wonder if the HRRR is maybe a little over convective here. Do I think we'll see this much convection? I'm not quite sure, but I definitely think that whatever does convect will probably see some upscale growth if we see the morning convection and if the smoke actually ends up inhibiting how much we can destabilize throughout the day.
Absolutely excellent analysis. And that leads me to the final question I have for you, Kyle. If we are looking at maybe one single lever that will move the dial, so to speak, helping this event either to reach its ceiling or perhaps sending it crashing down to the floor, what's the most important thing that storm chasers should be looking for today when it comes to chasing potential?
Yeah, I would say right away, and I'm going to actually pull up the simulated infrared satellite here. That's going to be going into the early morning hours, watching the convection evolve in parts of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and into Manitoba. You can see that the IR satellite here from the HRRR is pretty extensive as we go through the morning. If we see this convective complex here that's moving through parts of Saskatchewan and into Manitoba, if we see that convective complex stay to the north and maybe some of those clouds stay out of the area, this might be a good thing for us. We might be able to keep our destabilization maxed out as much as we can to help fight that cap. If we're able to fight that cap, then we're going to have convective initiation. So I think that's definitely the first thing. If we see that these storms or this convective complex is too far south, not going to be a good thing for us. We don't want those clouds. We don't want that convective contamination of the environment. The second one would be if the cap holds until that better shear arrives, we could be looking at a pretty decent event if we're able to get a discrete storm in that nicely sheared environment.
Remember to check out those links in the description below and then watch another video.